Hello, James.
Hello, Robin.
Nice to see you again, or hear you again.
Exactly.
Has the world changed a little since we last talked?
Oh my God. My
Along some dimensions, at least.
yeah.
But we can escape all that for now, right? We can go off to the distant future. Big concerns and these minor recent disturbances won't bother us.
Well, actually, I think that some of the things that we're going to talk about become even more acute in this current apocalyptic climate. But okay.
Well, let's get into it and find out.
Sure.
So we've been tasked with talking about AI ethics, which is a topic that can lend itself to a wide range of related topics. And I know this is a subject of interest to you, so I suggest you pick what you think is the most important AI ethics topic to start with, and then I will see if I can talk about it with you.
Okay. Well, there was this article that I found from Julia Bossman from Foresight Institute. I thought she did a nice job of summarizing some of the principal discussions that people are having around AI ethics. And we've already talked about technological unemployment in our previous discussion.
We did?
But
we could stand to talk about it more, I suppose.
Yeah. I think that... Oh, I'm going to turn down the gain here because I think I'm over-modulating. Okay, check. I think that one of the interesting things in the current climate about technological unemployment is that the economic insecurity that a lot of people felt that led them to vote for Trump may have been contributed to by technological unemployment. I know that there's not a lot of agreement about, whether it's occurring yet or not, but it does seem to be one of the things that's out there. We don't have to belabor that particular point since we talked about it already. Let's see, what's the next topic she proposes? Skill-based technological change as a contributor to inequality. That was, I don't know that we delved into that too much the last time. Do you have an opinion about that?
We can just review. I tend to think that automation per se is a relatively minor contribution to the current issues. I think there are definitely a lot of issues in today's economy and labor market. I just think people are jumping way too quick to automation as an explanation for that, which is distinct from technology in general. There's lots of things that technology does to the labor market, and in particular, technology can make it easier for higher skilled people to get paid more and harder for lower skilled people to make more. There's a lot of different ways that can happen without a particular machine replacing a particular person on a particular job.
Yeah, but do you buy the argument that jobs in the middle of the income spectrum are more vulnerable to automation than jobs at the top and the bottom right now?
It's plausible, but again, I think the obsession with automation at the moment is a little much. There's been a bunch of very impressive demos in the last decade or so, and it's been in the news, and it's very sort of connects to science fiction, and it's dramatic. But honestly, automation, I think, is a minor contribution to the issues that are happening now. And there's a lot of things to be concerned about and deal with. But I think if you just try to focus on automation, you'll miss the big picture.
What do you think the principal contributors are to growing inequality?
Well, one of them is that, say, jobs are getting more complex, including via technology. And so that is a complement to people who have more skills and intelligence and conscientiousness. Jobs depend more on large organizations and being able to handle those and being at peace with those and not throwing a hissy fit all the time. I think jobs are concentrating into a smaller number of denser cities, and there's a problem with getting people to move from other places to those few dense cities. Part of it is, say, welfare benefits keep them back, or houses below underwater houses, but also regulation and housing limitations in the big cities. That is, if we had a lot more cheap housing available in these bigger cities, it would be easier to get people to move there as well. So those are some of the major contributions. Also, of course, just because we're rich, when people lose their job and are asked to sort of change whole careers and move to whole different states and et cetera, they're often less willing to do that than they might have been a century ago or so, when people were more desperate to find new places and jobs. That's a spattering of things.
None of the things that you're talking about actually contribute to inequality. They contribute to structural unemployment. But why would jobs in the middle of the income spectrum, why would the middle class be hollowed out by the things that you're talking about? Jobs in the middle of the income spectrum are disappearing.
There are a lot of explanations for that offered in the economics literature. I'm not very sure which ones are more right, but most of them don't have that much to do with automation. Is my main point. There's a lot of plausible things. So if you take a particular industry, say the media, we understand that a lot of reporters have lost their jobs in the last decade, but it's not because particular machines replaced reporters in automation. It was because of other sorts of technologies that made it easier for bloggers and other cheaper media to come in and displace reporters, and a lower demand for the advertising that's in newspapers via Google, and that took away the demand for newspapers. Again, for each industry there's lots of little explanations like that, and most of them don't have that much to do with automation.
Well, we seem to be talking past each other. You are arguing against technological unemployment, which is okay, but David Auteur at MIT, he has argued, and I think it's commonly accepted, it's widely accepted by some economists that his argument is right, is that jobs that are in the middle of the income spectrum are more automatable and are therefore more subject to these technological changes. You're saying that it happens, right? That there is technological replacement occurring, and what David's saying is that it happens more in certain kinds of jobs than in others, and that's what's a contributor to growing inequality. People who argued against that, like Robert Reich and others, argue that there are many policies, the decline of trade unions and NLRB policies and deindustrialization and so forth, that may be more causative of the growing inequality trends. And of course, Piketty argued that there's an inherent trend in the usual capitalist period that capital generates more income than labor does, and that therefore that's a trend towards greater inequality under the usual conditions of capitalism. So
those are all plausible arguments to me. I found all of those plausible, so I don't disagree with those, and I note that most of them don't have that much to do with automation.
Okay, that's fine. Well, one of the things I've looked at recently, which is also mentioned in this Bossman article, is the issue of algorithmic racism or algorithmic bias. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at this topic.
I've seen a few discussions of it. I'm much less concerned, I guess, than some seem to be. That is, our ordinary institutions, even when humans have a lot of discretion, already contain a lot of bias and discrimination. And when people embody their choices in algorithms instead, they may implicitly have such things as well, because the data sets on which these algorithms are fit are data of behaviors that had those things. But it seems like the more fundamental problem is the more basic institutions that allow and encourage these things, and whether it's expressed through individual discretion or algorithms seems less important to me.
Yeah, well, I think that's certainly one of the things that people are observing. Like when Google tries to train its search robots to automatically label images, and labels images of black men as gangsters and images of white people as, playing at the country club. That's a reflection not of the algorithm itself being racially biased, but by society being racially biased and the algorithm's just picking up on that. But I think the interesting question is, what do you do about that? Can you design algorithms to de-bias? And to help overcome those racial inequalities. Another example is sentencing algorithms. There's been a lot of work done now on the fact that some algorithms actually are sentencing blacks and whites differently, sometimes on the basis of actual likelihood of recidivism, and then the question is whether that's legitimate or not. Similar to the question of racial profiling in policing in general, or
Sure.
in detecting terrorism and so forth.
As an economist, I would just generally say, let's think about what are the overall causes of these things and overall solutions, and then if the fact that choices can be automated affects those causes or solutions, then we can think about automation or algorithms in that context. But mostly algorithms, aren't the first thing you would think about for the causes or the solutions of these problems.
Well, algorithms are incredibly helpful for some of these things. Like, for
Sure.
instance, trying to figure out what's going on in photographs. Google would either have to hire a billion Mechanical Turk workers, human workers, in order to label all the photographs, or it could assign an algorithm to do it. And so, the logic of artificial intelligence is that it's cheaper and faster and sometimes better than human beings. So,
Well, sure. There's a lot of things people do. I mean, most of these people are working in buildings, and it's nice to work in buildings instead of out of doors where the weather is hostile. That doesn't mean the fact that people are in buildings is especially relevant to the causes or consequences of these problems. I mean, I think there's a problem with just because AI is sexy, people try to connect everything to AI in order to make the topic sexy when the connections aren't really there.
Well, okay.
So, I mean, what concretely, if we talked about a particular kind of discrimination or a particular kind of bias, then we could try to make progress on its causes and solutions, and then we could see whether or not we thought algorithms were especially useful to think about in that context, but mostly.
Okay. Well, how about one of the examples? I was just meeting with some French roboticists, and we were talking about military and policing, use of robots in military and policing. And the kind of thought experiment right now that I gave them was that in a lot of African American communities, it's quite clear that white cops are racial, have racial implicit biases in their policing, at black cops too. And as a consequence that if you could imagine RoboCop actually being sent out into those communities with a non-racially biased policing algorithm in its head, that might be preferable. And this is, the logic behind some of these sentencing algorithms is that human judges are often fallible in this way, and that we might be able to overcome implicit racial biases in human, judging. So I do think that there's the artificial intelligence here is relevant. If we're trying to put human values and judgments into artificial intelligence and then fix the things that are wrong with human behavior, that is relevant to it being artificial intelligence.
There's a larger social science literature which raises questions or asks, why do we not make as many decisions as we could in more explicit ways? So I actually find this to be interesting puzzles. It's long been noted, for example, that when you're hiring people, that the interviews and the ratings you might give them in an interview are just not very predictive at all of how well they'll do on the job, and the sort of basic stats of what jobs they had before or what school they went to, etc. Those tell you most of what you can know about how to predict future job performance. Nevertheless, people are quite eager and spend a lot of effort in interviewing. And that's just one example of how there seems to be a tendency to want a lot of discretion when it doesn't seem to add that much predictive value. Even in medicine, there's a lot of studies that would suggest that simple statistical models do about as well as you can do in predicting what kind of diseases or treatments might be appropriate, but people really like to have a doctor with discretion. And similarly in investment, a lot of people really like to have an investment advisor they trust and they give discretion to, even though that seems to give them lower rates of return on average than just investing in an index fund without much discretion. So certainly one of the more basic causes of discrimination is discretion. The fact that we aren't willing to create these simple formulas. Often if you were to create a simple formula for these things, that simple formula would of necessity not be very biased or discriminatory. It would be focused on a few things that are relatively surface and relevant. So it seems to me before you think about, what can we do to fix algorithms, there's a more basic question: why are people so reluctant to use simple algorithms and formulas and rules to make a lot of decisions where the data suggests, discretion hasn't added much value?
I think that's a good question. I mean, I actually did my doctoral work on partly on the effort to automate medicine, the medical decision making. And it's certainly taken a lot longer for diagnostic algorithms, expert systems to be rolled out, to be diffused into medical practice. And part of that is that professionals find them threatening and don't like to use them. So I think that's probably true in general. I mean, as you said, there's a lot of research now on the biases that get entered into looking for a new job candidate, and that when you put resumes through artificial intelligence, you can often demonstrate that you get better job candidates out of that process than actually having human beings do the thing.
So I do have a tentative explanation for that one, which might illuminate some of the other ones as well. It seems to me that on reflection, many decisions by firms are not that well explained by doing what's best interest of the firm overall, and they're better explained by doing what's in the best interest of a local political coalition of people who are trying to help their side. And it makes a lot of sense if you are a political coalition, when there's a new hire, to be able to select that person for whether they're giving signals of being loyal to you, and to be able to credibly signal to the rest of the organization and to them that they owe you, and that if they don't play ball with you, you can punish them. And that politically it makes a lot of sense to interview people for those reasons. Even if you don't tell how good they're going to be for the company as a whole, you can tell how well they will work with your coalition. It's more about compatibility and loyalty than about overall performance. And I think, a story about investment advising is that people feel like they gain more status if they can claim credit for somebody with discretion. They gave discretion to who did better than average. And if they just invest in an index fund, it looks like they can't really claim any credit. So even if they lose money on average, they like the win scenario of, if I picked this guy and he did better than average, and so I'm better than average because of that. And they're willing to lose on average in order to get that sort of story they can tell about how they just had the judgment of knowing the right guy to pick. And again, that suggests that people just like discretion in various ways. And that's going to be a barrier to using algorithms in general for many things, whether they're including biases or fixed biases.
Of course, the ability to make a profit or to be more efficient in a process is what can often overcome that barrier. In the case of medicine, if you arm a bunch of nurses with expert diagnostic systems and you get the same thing, same diagnostic or better diagnostic results out of much cheaper practice of medicine, then that's going to be compelling at some level.
We would hope, but of course, the regulatory process hasn't allowed them to do that, and it's not clear they will. And even if when the regulatory process does allow that, it's not clear how many patients are going to be willing to do that, because patients often do want to be treated by the higher status person, and they prefer the doctor to the nurse, even if you could show them statistics that the nurse does just as well, which we can now. I mean, I can already show you statistics that nurse practitioners do about as well as primary care doctors at basic medicine.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is many states allow an expanded nurse practitioner scope of practice, so it is beginning to happen, and of course it's been talked about for decades. But I think this may be one of the areas where I think the dynamic of capitalism is actually going to be quite compelling. That in many areas, for instance, call center, having a human on the other end of the line when you call a company to have a complaint or to get some kind of help is something that many consumers would prefer. But if you put people through a call center, dial, click 1 if you have this kind of problem, and then click 2 if you have that kind of problem, that narrows it down and provides a kind of very simple expert system that is cheap, but even though it reduces consumer satisfaction, but the overwhelming cost effectiveness of it weighs against the lower consumer satisfaction.
For cheap products, definitely. For more expensive products, people are often willing to pay more to have that extra personal attention. So it's a matter of where in the product quality spectrum you're sitting.
Right. But since there's a tendency towards artificial intelligence and information systems in general becoming cheaper, they're going to eventually be so cheap that it will be compelling to do them in all these domains.
Well, they'll have to be good as well as cheap. And I do think, again, people are getting ahead of themselves here, that the rate of improvement of these is relatively slow and will be for a while. Eventually, they will be good. But if you're willing to trust the capitalist competitive process to get people to use automation in the first place, you might trust that process to also, get them to use less biased or less discriminatory automation. It would be a similar sort of competitive process that would push in that direction to a limited degree.
Yeah, I mean, in hiring, there's been that argument for a long time that racist hiring is bad for a firm. And so if you can overcome a firm's tendency to only want to hire white guys, you would get talented folks of other types.
There has been that argument, and it's been a surprisingly weak effect over time, hasn't it?
Yes, and probably partly because of what you were describing, which is that there's often a political dynamic in...
Right, so most teams are more productive when they're more homogeneous in terms of gender, age, ethnicity, other sorts of backgrounds. And the only kind of diversity that's really productive for teams is diversity in sort of expertise or style of thought. And so, when you have a political coalition in a firm that's based around some common ethnicity, gender, etc., they're going to want to pick other people for their coalition like them. And even if that's not in the interest of the firm as a whole, that's the sort of thing that happens a lot. And that's, I would guess, one of the main sort of sources of these persistent patterns.
Well, aren't you implying that it would be in the interest of the firm as a whole to just have a bunch of white guys?
No, I'm saying if there's a coalition that's white guys in the firm, they want to pick other people who they fit in with. They can judge them by looking at their face. They can laugh with them together. They can socialize together, and they can form a tight little coalition. And those people are going to pick people like themselves, even if the firm as a whole would be better off with a wider range of people who are more picked for productivity.
So the subgroups are more productive, but the firm as a whole could be harmed. So this was...
Right.
Okay. But there's two different levels of productivity there. I mean, I think some of the research would suggest that, in fact, firms would be better off if they were able to overcome that dynamic.
And again, these are the key issues to think about, and they're hard, and the automatability of it is relatively minor, at least for now. I mean, it is so hard to automate many of these things, many of these things are relatively easy to automate in the sense that for a long time we've known sort of formulas that are about as well as you can do, but there's been these obstacles to applying them.
Do you think that you ever have a cognitive bias against interpreting the evidence in favor of artificial intelligence, since you want to argue so strongly for emulation as the path?
Well, I mean, I'm also an economist who's talking about technology, and so the more that technology matters, the more that would be better for me. And I was an AI researcher for 9 years, so I think I can see better than, say, most economists how to tell which things are actually useful and productive and which things are more hype and smoke.
So an awful lot of artificial intelligence, I mean, I'm a sociologist, so what do I know? But an awful lot of the artificial intelligence folks seem to be thinking that there is, in fact, now an accelerating trend of progress in deep learning and these other technologies.
Well, there is a boom of activity, but there have been booms of activity and concern, every decade or two going back a long way. There's no doubt there's a boom of activity at the moment. But the question is whether there's any evidence that this will be a boom that's bigger than any of the previous booms. And so, the total amount of activity is still very tiny compared to the world economy. And even compared to, say, the dot-com boom, where you could plausibly say that the stock market was expecting at least a substantial chance of a very big boom in the value of technology in the economy, that's not really happening at the moment. The percentage of the stock market that's in the tech sector has been relatively constant over a decade. So, we don't see that sort of indication. And when you talk to people who are in firms, who are near projects where people say, we're going to try to do AI here, the main thing I hear is that people are just going too far to try to use fancy AI techniques when they haven't really done simple techniques. and that's where they expect most of the value. So there's a lot of cynicism out there about they have to sort of pretend to be doing the new fancy AI techniques when they're really just doing simpler things, because that's the sort of thing that's appropriate in most firms' contexts. So that suggests to me that while this new technology does have some places where it works, it's not about to revolutionize everything. It's a relatively niche technology that is going to have some products that matter and are important, but it's not going to take over everything. Even if, for example, in the next 10 or 20 years, self-driving cars and trucks basically displace all taxi drivers or truck drivers, etc., that would still be within the range of job displacement we've seen over the last century. It would be another burst of automation of the sort we've seen for a long time. So I say that is a substantial effect, but that's the sort of thing you should be looking for in the near term. Yeah. But eventually there'll be a big change.
That would be sort of the thing we should be looking for if we wanted to prove the thesis that there is going to be technological unemployment.
More than there has been over the last century. That is, there has been automation replacing humans on jobs for a long time. That's been one of the major sources of growth. It's just been, slow enough that it's at any one time it's only a small fraction of jobs that get displaced. That's the sort of rate at which I would expect things to continue until eventually all of a sudden things are very different. And I do think we should think about that future time and think about how to prepare for it. And I'm happy to focus on that, to move to that topic if you'd like. But that's different than thinking we're in a crisis at the moment and that we need to do something now about a current problem. There are current problems we should do things about now. I just don't think they are that much having to do with AI and automation.
What are the current problems you want to do something about?
I would very much like to sort of to get more housing, to get the yoke of zoning regulation off of the ability to have more housing. I think that would help a lot of people who are now suffering outside the major cities where most of the big jobs are to move there and become part of those booming economies.
How does artificial intelligence impact housing?
Not much at all. Not in the short term. You're asking.
Well, the topic of the conversation is the ethics of artificial intelligence.
Right. So that's why I was thinking. I don't actually see that much happening in the short run about AI. I do see longer run issues about AI. That was what I was trying to say.
I see.
But if you want to talk about other things in the short run, we can talk about that. But
sure. Well, I'll just move on to the next topic that this article suggests, which is security. I mean, I think it's very much on everyone's mind now that since Putin and WikiLeaks conspired to defeat Hillary Clinton and the FBI conspired, it's very much on people's mind, security, surveillance state, artificial intelligence, all that kind of stuff. And one of the things that I've always argued to the singularitarians is that instead of worrying about this fully formed super intelligence jumping out of the box to whack people, that there's a kind of approximate set of risks of artificial life and AI-empowered cyber warfare and cyber terrorism that we should be working with cyber experts, cybersecurity experts on trying to get them to think the next couple steps ahead of what the AI terrain might look like in their domain, and that might in fact help us prepare for the kind of resilient internet that is necessary to prepare against truly artificial general intelligence bootstrapping itself. Is that something that you've ever worked on?
Well, I'm not in the security industry, but I meet with people often enough and talk to them and hear about it to have some perceptions of what it's like. I just gave a talk at Gartner Access Management Conference a couple weeks ago. It certainly seems that security is one of these places, all the more so, where you say, well, most of the action is in relatively simple things. Most of the ways that systems are broken into are not because their AI wasn't smart enough. It's because people were doing relatively simple, stupid things. And most of the reason why software is vulnerable to security flaws is the fact that people don't take security as seriously early in software development. And that's a basic problem with the development process that we have for software. People are so eager to get the first product out there with some remotely plausible features that they don't put a priority on security, and then later on when they try to go back and clean things up, it's very hard to sort of add security later to things that you didn't think ahead of time, security from the beginning. So but in all of that, I just don't see much of a place for AI in the near term.
Well, MIT folks have, for instance, have recently come up with a cybersecurity system that they claim is much faster at identifying intrusions into the security of a system and counteracting them with measures, and it's based off of deep learning or neural nets or some such. So it is, people are working on attempting to use AI both for defensive purposes, and I'm sure that people are working on using AI for offensive purposes. So,
sure, I would just put that in the class of what we used to call statistics. So AI is a new kind of technique that sits in the place where statistics used to sit before, but it's always been useful to try to create various tools to statistically distinguish various events, and that will continue to be true, but it's a relatively minor part of the overall process. But it'll continue to be.
It seems like you're doing the same thing that people always do to AI, which is as soon as it accomplishes something, you say, well, that's not the really important part of AI. That's just, you can make cars faster, you can make them drive by themselves, but that's not really AI, and that's just statistics. How's that? What is it that is going to be AI that isn't just statistics?
Oh, in the end, it may all be just statistics. So I would just say, the key issue is the rate of job displacement and the total amount of job displacement.
Correct.
That is, the rate question is, will the percentage of people who lose their jobs to automation over the next 10 or 20 years be substantially different than the percentage that we've seen over the last century or two? If it stays the same rate, and that continues to be true for a century, the integral of all that improvement over a century will be a lot of improvement and a lot of gain, but we could still deal with that automation in the same way we've been dealing with it for the last century of trying to help people change jobs and change careers, etc., as they need to when jobs change.
Or redistributing wealth through the social welfare state.
That's one option. And we could talk about the value of these various options for dealing with these problems, and then there's the other.
That's not the one you like, then.
Well, I'm less interested in declaring which ones I favor or not than sitting down and analyzing with you or someone else. What are the trade-offs and what are the things we should get into. So,
isn't discussing what the trade-offs are going to lead to a normative conclusion about which is the best outcome?
It might well in the end when you're forced to draw it all together. But my intellectual attitude is more to try to chip away at things, to try to, when there's a hard problem, try to find the problems near it that I can make concrete progress on, and try to collect sort of consensus and agreement on at least on the little parts and work toward that. So I'm well aware that things like how much we should redistribute is just like this problem that people just have not agreed on for a long time. It seems pretty intractable.
And you've been in economics for a long time. You haven't come to a conclusion yet about whether the social welfare state's a good idea or not?
Yes, I think one of the virtues of knowing a field well is knowing when sort of simplistic summary points of view are not very useful. And so I think that sort of simplistic summary point of view is not a very useful way to express one's views, and rather express more subtle, context-dependent views that I can have more confidence in.
Okay, well, let's just take unemployment insurance. Is it a good idea or a bad idea, and what's the subtle way to look at it?
Well, obviously, one standard issue with unemployment insurance or any kind of insurance, there's moral hazard and adverse selection. You're worried about the existence of the insurance changing people's behavior. That's the moral hazard part. And you're worried about the people who are more at risk, knowing that and buying insurance. There's the question of to what extent could people privately arrange for this insurance and have it be more flexible versus imposing a state insurance system. There's a question of the time scale, how far that should be. So can you buy insurance for your grandkids, etc.?
Do you think people should have private unemployment insurance? We should encourage people to sock money away for when they're unemployed.
That's at least a plausible thing to consider when evaluating unemployment insurance. I mean, look, if you just take a thing that goes wrong in the world and you declare we're going to create a government insurance program for it, you can just directly, mitigate the risks that people are immediately feeling, but you do get in the way of a larger process that the economy might go through to create more subtler forms of insurance that might decide who gets more or less.
There's no country in the world that has a private unemployment insurance program. So, I mean, basically you're just saying If well, anyway, okay, but it's not on the topic of unemployment of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence may or may not be contributing to contemporary actual declines in the rate of employment. But as we discussed last time, the actual proportion of the U.S. population that is in paid employment has been declining steadily since 2000. It's somewhat leveled off in the last year, but and the economic recovery and the amount of employment growth since the 2008 recession has been incredibly sluggish, and probably is partly attributable to artificial intelligence and automation and all these other trends. But I
very partly, I would say.
It's a complicated debate. You don't buy it.
Right. Again, there's all these other things happening. But so I would think if you want to talk about AI risk, you should think farther into the future when the problems will be bigger. The problems are relatively minor at the moment in terms of AI. They are within the range of problems we're familiar with that we're already, but there will be times when it's much bigger.
The problem I have with the libertarian, I think that there's an elective affinity between trying to wave off the proximate risks of artificial intelligence to employment, security, and so forth, and only focus on the risks of big super god AI jumping out of the box and whacking humanity, because most of the folks who are libertarian don't think that governments can do anything about artificial intelligence, and so they don't want to focus on the things that we might be able to do something about in the proximate short term. They like focusing on the big risks coming down the pike, because they don't think that governments would be able to do anything about those either. So what I'm trying to say is, I think that these proximate risks are a legitimate part of the conversation, even if you don't think that they're happening right now. That in the next 10 years there will be artificial, intelligence-induced technological unemployment, and that we need to have social policies that address them. And talking about private unemployment insurance is not the way to address them. And I think that part of the reason why folks want to skip ahead and say, well, let's only talk about catastrophic or existential risks of artificial general intelligence is because they don't want to talk about these short-term things.
Is it clear to you that we need a different response to people who get unemployed in the next 10 or 20 years because of automation than because of anything else? I mean, there's lots of other things that cause unemployment. Why have a different response to AI's induced unemployment?
Because if the scenario of technological unemployment comes to pass, which is sudden and relatively rapid declines in the proportion of the population that's in paid employment, and then the fiscal basis of the state through income tax begins to shrink, combined with the fact that
okay, so you're talking about a big event then, right?
Longer.
So you're saying if we have an event in the next 10 or 20 years that's much different than the events we've seen over the last century, then we will want a different response. That right?
Well, the kinds of social policies that I advocate have humanitarian, ethical, political rationales all by themselves. The expansion of the welfare state and universal basic income guarantee. But it's relatively hard for me and many people to imagine what a fair and plausible political economic future would look like with a scenario of technological unemployment, other than the expansion of the social welfare state to include something like a basic income guarantee. So yes, I think that's why we need to start
just to be clear, I was saying let's, if minor changes in the next decade or two are less we should deal with in the way we've been dealing with similar things now, but eventually we have something big and that may require a different response. And you are saying, it seems to me, let's talk about what happens when there's a much bigger event, what different response to have for that.
Right, but I thought you wanted to skip ahead to evil genies jumping.
No, not necessarily. I just anything big and different.
Okay. So how big would So right now we've had a decline from 65% of the population in paid employment to 62% over the last 15 years. That's not huge, but if it went down to 50% over the course of the next decade, would that be big enough?
Not obviously, certainly, but I think eventually there will be a point when, say, within a 10-year period, basically pretty much all humans lose their jobs. And that's certainly a big enough event to be worth thinking about a different response to.
I would imagine so, yeah.
So, but, and that is the sort of thing that isn't right around the corner, but if you wait until it happens, it may be too late to do some things about it.
So we agree.
So the question is what to do about that then.
Right.
And one thing is, if we want to prepare for that event, we could sort of set up insurance against that particular risk. We could say, in the event where, say, basically less than 30% of world income goes to human wages, then we trigger this event where we say, aha, the robot apocalypse is upon us, and now the insurance pays out. That's a kind of insurance that could make sense against that risk. If you just set up a, say, basic income program now, it could cover that risk later maybe, but you're covering a lot more. You're paying out a lot in a lot other states of the world and a lot earlier. So I have a concern that what you have this basic risk that's the key thing that you want to deal with, and the solution is not that well targeted at it, although what solutions are politically feasible is limited. And so I could be convinced in the end that even a solution that's not well targeted is the best we can do because the other options aren't as feasible. But that's my first concern, is to set up some arrangement that's as well targeted as possible for the actual risk. So that would be an insurance that doesn't really turn on until lots of people losing their jobs, and then it also needs to be drawing on a world base of resources. If each local place tries to set up separate insurance like this, there's a problem that the new robot economy may not at all be uniformly distributed around the earth. It may be very concentrated in just a few places, and only those who have assets in those places will be able to cover these problems.
Well, on your latter problem, I mean, we socialists have long talked about whether you can have socialism in one country, and the experience of European social democracy in many countries, in fact, is that it is, in fact, difficult in a competitive global capitalist economy to have the kind of social welfare protections that you would like without having capital flee. So I think there is a question about the transnationalization of some of these policies. That's one of the reasons why I've long been a fan of the European experiment, such as it is now failing, but that hopefully what they would have been able to establish within the European Union, those kinds of policies. And countries like the United States are relatively big enough, hopefully, to establish policies without too much risk of capital flight.
But this is sort of the escalation that I worry about. You have a specific problem, and we need to do something about that specific problem. And then if you say, well, one solution to that problem is to have socialism, and you can't really have socialism unless you have global socialism. So now we need global socialism in order to solve this one problem. And you've really made your problem a lot harder, perhaps, by escalating it to these grand solution to everything. I would rather.
If you think that the solution is global socialism, which I do.
It's the only solution. That is, even if you think it is a solution, is it the only solution? Is it the easiest solution?
Is it the easiest solution? Well, right now it seems like barbarism is the alternative. I mean, we have a government right now that's coming in that is composed of corporate kleptocrats, religious fundamentalists, and generals, led by a fascist. And so, really, I do think that we need to start thinking seriously about some radical and otherwise more attractive options. But at any rate...
well, I don't necessarily share your overall evaluation there, but certainly this moment seems like exactly the wrong time to say now the solution is, full global socialism. I mean, because the world's moving the other way over the last few years.
That's precisely why we need to start talking about. Well, I mean, I've been talking about it forever, but and as have others. I think we've needed transnational governance since World War II in order to curtail the risks of the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and we haven't gotten it. And we started wars in Iraq, and we've been, chomping on our nails, waiting for North Korea to drop nukes on people ever since. And
so this is a basic
transnational governance
difference in you and I.
Necessary to actually establish collective security.
So my intuition or my style is to say I want to find a solution to a particular problem, and then try to minimize that solution or find the essence of that solution that I could propose to lots of people all across the political spectrum. And I say, right, whatever your other opinions.
Transnational governance is a good solution to a particular problem, such as the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction?
I might say think about the weapons of mass destruction and think about what solutions can I offer to that would be acceptable for a wide range of people, even people who don't want to have global socialism. And similarly for AI risk, I might say for the AI risk that you and I could agree on, what solutions can we come up with that we might be able to get a lot of different people to buy into and accept, even if they won't accept, the grand solution you might want to everything. I mean, I might have grand solutions to everything too that I might like, say futarchy, which is my favorite invented form of government, but I also don't think there's a huge chance that's going to happen soon enough to deal with these problems. So I'm also willing to set aside my favored solution and ask, what sort of compromises that can we come up with that might solve these problems? So,
well, I mean, I agree. We need to have, and yes, global socialism's not on the table. What's on the table is how can we address the economic insecurity that led many people to vote for fascism here in the United States and increasingly in Europe. The kinds of inequality that is leading to people thinking that they have to throw a Molotov cocktail of crap at Washington, D.C. In order to express their disdain for the economic crisis that they find themselves in. And I think we need to actually have real solutions, and talking about privatizing this and privatizing that is not actually the solution, although that's the one that they're going to get for their trials. Anyway, I think, if we look forward to artificial intelligence exacerbating both the security risks that we face and the economic risks that we face, the current crisis of nationalism, racism, austerity economics is precisely the wrong direction we need to go. And we need to push back and increase economic security through collective provision and increase collective security at the international level through strengthening transnational institutions. And that's the only way to counteract the threat, the catastrophic risks that we face from the rise of neo-fascism.
And I'm just uncomfortable with trying to pull in AI for every other political agenda that one might have. That is, in the near term, AI is probably going to be a relatively minor thing in the background, as it's been for a half century or more. And there are most of the things you're concerned about in the economy and in the world at the moment don't have that much to do with AI, but we should think about what to do about them. But we might agree that eventually there will be this much larger AI problem. And if, as people who have specialized in thinking about that, can we say something more particular about it, and something that we could agree across a wide political gulf, that even though we disagree on other things, we can agree on that.
So what is the larger AI problem that you anticipate?
Well, the most straightforward problem that I anticipate is that within a short time, say 10 years, we go from over half of world income going to human wages, as it does now, and down to basically zero. That would be a sudden, dramatic loss of humans' ability to earn wages. That would be quite a surprise, right?
If it happens overnight, right? If it starts to happen,
yes, of course, it makes a difference if it's overnight. Because
I mean, the kinds of social policy solutions that we would need if income disappeared, we can start to prepare now. Even if as we have seen this decline of the population in paid employment. So we can begin to anticipate that we're going to face these trends and begin to put those social policies in place. And if it takes a decade, it takes a decade. If it happens overnight, it happens overnight, right?
Well, if you set up a program of insurance that's ready for that event, then you can set it up well in advance and be ready. I'm not sure that...
Just to be clear, the program of insurance that you're talking about is everyone has stock, right?
Not necessarily. They could be an insurance contract that with an insurance company or some other organization that's declared it as insurance. But
how would insurance companies survive the collapse of capitalism? This is kind of a puzzle.
Well, that's exactly the same question. How would these government programs that are supposedly ready to hand out benefits survive it either? That is, whoever it is, they need to set themselves up with a globally diversified, relatively, conservative set of assets that they could use to pay off in this event. It's not enough for them just to have the good intention of transferring from some people to other people. The people they transfer from may not be around.
Well, transfer, it's a good point, because in fact, one of the things I'm saying is that it's not going to be equitable to have the fiscal basis of the state be entirely transfer payments from workers to non-workers if the workers keep shrinking and the non-workers keep growing. And therefore, this is in fact why a new political economy is entirely plausible
Well,
because
not just transfer from workers, but you might trying to be transferring from capital. But in order to do that, you'll need the capital to sort of be close enough under your thumb to do that, and that's something that may not easily happen.
right. Well, the kind of thing that I imagine is that we will need forms of collective ownership over capital in order to, in order to subsidize the.
In a sense, an insurance contract is a collective ownership. I mean, it depends on what kind of collective you have in mind. But so just without saying whether the insurance is government provided or privately provided, I want to say, well, we need to set up an insurance arrangement, something that has some assets that will be valuable in this risky scenario, and that can then use those assets to help the people for whom it is set up as the insurance for. So the question is how to set that up.
Convergence between your perspective and mine then, except that the principal difference is that I would want there to be a relatively egalitarian citizen stake in that collective insurance program, and you would not, I presume.
I think this is a more of a meta difference in our point of view. I am trying to have and state as few opinions as possible, and you want to have an opinion about everything. It seems like you just have a whole worldview, and you for each possible policy question you have an opinion, and you're happy to state it. And I don't want to necessarily state opinions on every possible policy question that comes up. I'm searching for the fewer things I can say that I can have more confidence and say, as somebody who's thought carefully about this particular solution in this particular area deserves your attention. And it's not based on my entire worldview and a secret way I'm slipping my whole agenda in. It's trying to help you out in whatever context you're in.
Well, it's nice to pretend that one is a technocratic expert and never has an opinion. Yes, I have an opinion. I have a worldview. I've had one for a very long time. And I think that world events just keep validating it. So maybe that's confirmation bias. But I also run a think tank that's on ethics and emerging technologies, where we try to come up with public policy opinions about things, and from a relatively consistent point of view.
But I think that's a real problem in the intellectual world today. That is, there's so many people who feel so confident in believing particular points of view that they then use that as a litmus test to decide who they are even willing to talk to. And then they get sort of lock in with particular points of view. So I intellectually think it's better to not commit to a lot of things early in an analysis and keep them open, and commit to when you need to commit to particular decisions and points of view based on they're having particularly strong evidence and reason to take those. So again, in our discussion, I would say, well, let's start from the things we most agree on and see how far we can go. Just saying things we agree a lot about.
Do you have a normative first principle? I mean, is there something about the world that you think is an ideal to strive towards?
Well, as an economist, I'm quite comfortable with the usual implicit economist normative ideal, which is Pareto optimality, efficiency as we call it, trying to get as many people as much of what they want as possible. That I think it's definitely a useful framework for being a neutral analyst trying to help people. You can say, this is my standard, and this is the way I analyze things, and that's why you should find my advice useful. I don't want to be someone who says, well, I favor the red people in the world, and since you're red, you're on my side, so I'm going to help you out. And dang those blue people, it's just...
But if you say that a world in which there's Pareto optimality and everybody gets what they want is the ideal world to strive towards, isn't that a yardstick against which you can measure different social policies and say, does it get us further towards that world?
It can be. That is, sometimes it's hard to tell, and other times it's easier to tell. But I also want to be careful and say when it's hard to tell, I will tell you and say, gee, for that one I haven't figured out yet which way it leans. And that also is how I want to be a trustworthy advisor who tells you what he doesn't know.
Well, I do that too. I mean, I for instance, with the military robots, I'm not quite sure whether we can have military robots that have fewer collateral casualties than human beings, or whether it's entirely safe to have neo-fascists like Trump have an army of military robots. So, there's things I don't have an opinion on yet, or that I'm still open to. Whether a future in which everybody has a relatively egalitarian stake in economic security as a desirable future, I'm committed to that as a normative yardstick in the same way that you are to Pareto optimality.
So
I don't see why that compromises my public policy or ethical judgment or my analytical rigor.
I guess one key question I think should be asked when one talks about AI risk is, which risks or problems do we need to deal with now, and which should we wait and deal with later? This is a question we have to ask about all problems and risks in the world, but especially about AI, because a great many of the most dramatic risks aren't going to show up anytime soon. And so, as you indicated, there are these other set of risks people are concerned about, bad acting AIs. And there's a very real question about whether we should be doing a lot now to try to think about those and prepare and prevent them, or whether we should wait until those sorts of problems appear more concretely, at which point we would know a lot more about in what situations they appear, in what form, and how to deal with them. And so,
why doesn't it make sense in all these domains, if we can think about a risk, to start preparing for it now? I mean, I agree with you that we'll know more later. I mean, if we'd tried to prepare for the risks of artificial intelligence in the 1950s, we'd be trying to battle, building-sized machines instead of
right.
ones that we can fit in our pockets.
Well, but again,
still, the general principle would have been appropriate for us to start.
It's probably always fine to have some, subset of scholars or intellectual people thinking about them and telling the rest of us whether they've come up with anything we should be paying more attention to now. But perhaps the usual answer will be, we're still thinking, no, there's nothing really you should pay attention to now, but we'll let you know. And that was the right answer in the 1950s, right? That would have been the right answer in the 1950s.
You don't favor the current tranche of funding that's going into artificial intelligence risk?
No, not really. Again, although I'm not that concerned if it's only a small fraction, because again, I think it's fine if we spend a small fraction continually tracking and thinking about all sorts of things. But the idea that now is the time we need to deal with this problem, and if we wait much longer, it'll be too late. That seems pretty implausible to me.
But your scenario is that we're going to go from 0 to 100. That we're going to have a complete drop off in human employment. So why wouldn't we need to start preparing? Well, I don't understand why you think we should wait until it seems like we're just about to fall off the cliff.
So that might be a risk. You can say, well, that particular thing is something we should think about ahead of time, but the risk that an AI might be rude or cause a war or drop a bomb or things like that, those sorts of AI risks might not be the sort we should be thinking about now. Yes, I think the risk that within 10 years we would all lose our jobs, that does sound like the sort of risk that insurance is appropriate for, and insurance is intrinsically something you need to set up ahead of time. So I think one answer to why should we worry about that now is exactly that problem requires insurance, and insurance needs to be prepared ahead. So that is the form of the argument I would give. Among the various AI risks, that's the one I would most suggest you think about now because of that one feature.
Okay, look, we have 5 minutes left. Let's tackle the last thing that this article suggests, robot rights. Is that something that you've given much thought to?
I certainly have. I'm not sure to what extent our opinions today about rights will matter that much in the future when the rights are actually chosen. That is, the question is, to what extent can we sort of entrench our current opinion about rights? So in the topic of my book, The Age of M, those robots are very human-like, and they will have the same desire for or inclination toward rights, and rights will mean similar things for them as it does for us. So in that scenario, it makes a lot more sense to talk about their rights. But even then, it's hard to know what we can do now to ensure their rights. In the Age of M scenario, some people, including my colleague Brian Kaplan, have declared that they will all be slaves, and everybody will be happy with that because everybody will agree they have no moral value because they're made out of metal, and metal things don't have moral value. I find that somewhat implausible, but the more strong point I make is that in this transition to the Age of M, you would have to get volunteers to choose to move over to become emulations, and if they expect to be slaves, that won't go over well. So I think at the beginning, for the mere purpose of recruiting, well, you will want to set up a regime with the sorts of rights that would be enough to get people to be recruited to come over. For other kinds of AI, Of course, it matters a lot what they're like. So it is much harder to say in general what generic AI would be like. If AI is much like software we've seen, that is, if we say, so I have a grant at the moment that I'm working on, just exploring the scenario of what happens if eventually we get AI by slowly accumulating software of the same sort that we've had for 70 years with no particular revolution. At that point, the software is just very capable and enormous, but each part of it looks like the pieces of software that we've seen so far. That doesn't inspire many people to be inclined to generate rights, but I still don't think it's obvious.
I agree with you. I'm not terribly interested in the question of robot rights anymore, and partly for the reason that you just said, which is that I think that the actual implementation of artificial intelligence in the future will be so far removed from what we understand as liberal human individual selfhoods that we won't be inclined to attempt to even attribute rights to them, much less encourage their rights-bearing behavior.
I think another way to think about it is there'll just be a lot of new kinds of diversity to get our heads around and to decide how to treat. So, in our world recently, we've been encompassed a lot of new kinds of diversity among humans, or not new kinds, but new attitudes toward diversity, or more explicit ways to engage those kinds of diversity. And for the most part, our attitude has been to try to sort of treat them all as equal and on the same playing field and give them all the same rights. There's an open question where that sort of attitude of egalitarianism toward diversity can survive the far wider range of diversity we will encounter as we have a huge range of different kinds of artificial minds.
I guess I'll just say in closing, always fun to talk to with you, Robin, and we share such divergent views and approaches to the whole set of questions that it is in fact quite stimulating.
We differ on some dimensions quite a lot, and on other dimensions we are quite close, and that's the nature of people who are not near the center of the distribution. That's how we have to talk with most everyone, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay. Talk to you again soon.
Take care. Bye.
Okay, bye.